Perhaps no other war in American history, certainly World War I made America wealthy, World War II made America powerful, but the 7-Year War, a war that took place in the 1750s and early 60s, would come to define America perhaps more than any other event in our history. And the reason is that this was a global war, a war in which the British had decided that they wanted to expand against the French. They attacked French positions in the areas in Quebec, in Canada, in areas east of the Mississippi, with the design to take control of basically Northern America. That war also, many of us know it as the French and Indian War, was a time of great conflict throughout the world. In fact, it was really a global war. And when the war was done, the British stood alone as masters of North America. France had to cede all of their lands east of the Mississippi, only holding those areas that would later become the Louisiana Purchase. They lost all of their basic ports. They won from Spain, Florida, and the areas along the coast. They took islands in the Caribbean. But what they took mostly out of the 7-Year War was debt. For one of the first times in the history of the British Empire, they were borderline bankrupt. They had nearly nothing. And when Parliament gathered in 1763, they knew something had to be done to raise money for future battles that they knew would come from the French, who continued to grow in wealth and stature. So they concocted a plan, as parliaments often do. They would issue taxes on those freeloading colonists who had enjoyed their protection but contributed very little to the British Empire. Taxes were instituted because of the 7-Year War, and taxes would come to define the colonists' frustration, irritation, and anger with the British. Those taxes began first in the form of levies and tariffs, and then they became more direct, hitting things that were very specific to the now very powerful merchant class, especially in Boston. Soon these taxes started to become more aggressive. And in an economy that was very different than we can relate to these days, because prices fluctuated radically based upon the income of goods and services from all over the world, a single tax could drive prices to a place where it was unaffordable to buy the products that before were commonplace. This gave rise to rebellion, and it gave rise to a group of men led by a gentleman by the name of Samuel Adams, called the Sons of Liberty. Now, these were mostly gentlemen, gentlemen being defined as men of wealth and stature, who gathered together to meet and discuss how they would chase the British and their taxes from their city. The problem was the Sons of Liberty were really, for the most part, powerless militarily. They had nothing. But they did have the masses, and they did control a very powerful weapon of the day, the newspapers and the printing presses. The British, starting to feel the pressure in the 1860s, into 1866, 67, 68, started to send more troops into Boston, coming to a point when they had nearly 4,000 troops in a city of 15,000 people. It became so oppressive that they were quartering them in homes, forcing food, and jobs became scarce because the British soldiers didn't make enough, and so they were taking jobs from the citizens. This became a huge boiling point as these two groups began to collide. Now, some of those troops began to be pulled back as the British felt they had control, and the governor there became stronger and more able to control the circumstances. But Samuel Adams and his group also became more and more powerful in drawing no small part of Bostonians to their cause. This led us to a time in 1770 when really there was a boiling point that became almost impossible to manage. And Samuel Adams was happy, because if there was nothing more that he desired than probably good beer, was to get the British out of Boston completely. He wanted them gone. And him and his group, the Sons of Liberty, started pushing for this in a lot of really very subversive ways. It was no small task to remove the most powerful nation in the world from your city, but Samuel Adams was up to the task. Coming into March of 1770, this pressure began to build not just at a political level, but on a street level, meaning that the British soldiers could barely walk through the city without being mocked, harassed, harangued, chased, having things thrown at them, and the pressure began to mount day after day after day. The governor came one day into the Harvard University after being called by some of his colleagues to look upon something that horrified him. In the halls of Harvard hung the portrait of the governor. In supposedly a safe and sacred place, his portrait hung dignified on a wall. But in the late days of February, early March of 1770, someone had gone in and with a knife sliced the heart out of that portrait, leaving a big hole in the governor's chest. This terrified him so much that without even taking his wife, he ran to a ship, got on it, and sailed to Great Britain immediately because he feared that he would be killed at any moment. His wife he knew would be safe. Don't take that too harshly on him, because women were never objects of the fight. They were always protected, regardless of what side they were by the folks at that time, at least for the most part. So he didn't fear for her safety. His life was a danger, and he knew it. Same time, British soldiers still looking for work. Now the numbers have been pared down to at least 700 in the city. We're going place to place for day jobs. One such man, a gentleman by the name of Kilroy, showed up at the home of a man by the name of Samuel Gray, who was a rope maker, asking for a job. Samuel Gray spit on him and told him, "I have a job for you. You can clean my outhouse." This insulted the 30-year-old private, who began to have words, and the two men began to fight. Gray was a respected merchant and maker of rope. The private was also well known in his group as an older, more seasoned soldier, but still a private. The two men fought, the fight was broken up, and they went their separate ways. On the evening of March 3rd, the pressure in the city was palpable. There was no question that something was about to happen, and it wasn't going to be small. That day, somebody, no one ever really knows who, but there's little doubt that the Sons of Liberty had something to do with it, posted bills all over the city indicating that the British officers had a plan to systematically attack and kill citizens in Boston. This enraged the people as they took these bills and passed them around. Now remember, the vast majority of the dock-working laborers of the time were illiterate. It was the gentlemen and their wives and the clergy that could read, but these people would incite the crowds by holding up these bills and reading them aloud, saying the British officers have a plan to kill us. And it looked official. It was on a piece of paper, the modern equivalent of the television, which looks official because it's on television. And the people bought it hook, line, and sinker, even though that document was a forgery. The pressure now came to a place which was intolerable. And on March 4th of 1770, young boys had gathered down near the Custom House. Now, the Custom House was an area where the king had ordered his money to be stowed, or at least the government under the direction of the king, or perhaps vice versa, depending on how you like to view British parliamentary procedure at the time. But in either case, it was held in this custom house on a street called King Street. That's where the taxes were kept until they would be taken in a ship. No electronic transfers, no bills. It was gold, hard silver, and goods that were there, and they had to be protected. And the British soldiers had men stationed there. Furthermore, they weren't given quarter anywhere. They didn't have any place to sleep, so they were all bunked in together in one room, holed up against this angry mob that would daily throw things and create issues. A young officer, or excuse me, a young private, a gentleman by the name of Montgomery, was standing guard at the time. He was out there on the street in his sentry position when young kids started coming up and mocking him, throwing snowballs and teasing him and creating problems. He chased them off in an angry fit, and to some accounts, and the accounts of these stories are really hard to know what is true because there's so many accounts. Some say that the boys were hit, others say they were simply chased off, but they ran away, and when they ran away, the story spread that British soldiers were injuring children. This created a fervor, and people started to gather. Within just a few minutes, 20, 30, 50 people, maybe up to 100 or even 200, had gathered together around the Commons House or the Customs House to battle, to yell, to scream at the British soldier. Being afraid for his life, he called for backup. And 8 soldiers now came out with one officer, a man by the name of Preston, Captain Preston, who found himself in the near impossible circumstances of 50 to 100 people clamoring and yelling at him and yelling at the British, throwing clamshells, trash, and such. Bells rang out. Now, a bell, when it rang for really only one purpose: fire. It meant there was an emergency and people were to gather together for a fire. People came from all sides to see what this bell meant and what it was ringing for. And as it gathered, the pressure now that had been building for years was about to explode. And not just explode, but explode in dramatic fashion. What happened next is a matter of some degree of controversy. But the net result of what happened was the following. The British fired their weapons at least 11 times, and people began to die. And not just die in a simple fashion, but in a very bloody fashion. Dramatized by the fact that it had snowed just a few days before, and the ground was still covered in white, pure snow. And the blood began to stain this snow in dramatic fashion. This crowd now found themselves dragging and trying to save people who were dying at the hands of the horrible British soldiers who had fired upon them and mercilessly, without mercy, killed these innocent people, including a very difficult situation, one Samuel, the rope maker, Gray. And in that crowd was that very young man who had fought with him just a few days earlier. The first man to die was a man by the name of Crispus Attucks, Attucks, a freed slave who had run away and escaped and come north where he had gained his freedom. He was the first shot in the front and went down and is often called the first martyr of the Revolutionary War there in 1770. The Boston Gazette, which was the powerful newspaper of the day, would put out a statement the next day about the event. I pulled the Boston Gazette from that day, and one of the great things about this event is it's extremely well documented, and the papers that day can be found online. And I pulled that paper to read some of the statements that were spread out immediately thereafter. And one of the statements said that the people that had gathered on King Street were lads and young people that had gathered and faced a charge of bayonets by British soldiers. The statement said, when the crowd had gathered and were ordered to disperse, and they did not, quote, on this, the captain, meaning Captain Preston, commanded his men to fire, saying to his men, damn you, fire, be the consequences what it will. Damn you, fire, the consequences be what they will. This is important because it was illegal for soldiers to fire upon civilians. It was not only illegal against the law, it was against military law. And the idea that a captain, a British captain, controlling these people's city would stand and say, fire on these people, was abhorrent. This information spread like wildfire. It was to Lexington and Concord, 50, 60 miles away, Roxbury and other cities within a matter of hours, and was soon spreading throughout really the colonies within a matter of, well, weeks, but back then that was considered fast. The paper went on to say this, says, but what showed a degree of cruelty unknown to British troops, at least since the House of Hanover, has directed their operation, was an attempt to fire upon or push with their bayonets the persons who undertook to remove the slain and wounded. These British soldiers, according to the Boston Gazette, not only massacred these people, but when the others came to aid them, they took, and to take their bodies away, they fired their weapons and shoved them with bayonets. Horrific scenes done by the enemy, the lobsterback, the redcoat, the horrible British soldier upon innocent people. This created now the very moment that Samuel Adams had hoped for. And his partner, a gentleman by the name of Paul Revere, what do I press here? Quickly put together a diagram or a famous lithograph or piece of art that outlined what happened that day. In that photo, or it's a photo here obviously, but in that diagram, the soldiers were shown in a position of power, firing upon Crispus, as well as other men who did all they could to defend themselves. In the more famous of the ones that spread throughout the colonies, Captain Preston was shown standing in a position of power with his sword in the air, ordering the death of these innocent people who were dressed not as laborers or dock workers, but as gentlemen, with a woman in the crowd pleading for them to stop, the British with distance between them, orderly, ready, and in an executorially fashion, killing these people. It was horrific. The acting governor that night, when he got word of this, ran from the street from his house, which was just a few blocks away. He described it as a bloody scene to which it covered his shoes. And he ran through the snow trying to settle things down and stop before this created a full-blown hysteria that would result in the death of many, many more. By the way, it was also shown, you can't see it very well, but up here, British soldiers had even positioned themselves as snipers in a window to kill by shooting down innocent people. 11 people were shot, 5 died. The acting governor, a gentleman who had really only had the job for 3 days since his prior boss, he was the lieutenant governor, his prior boss had his heart cut out at Harvard, a gentleman by the name of Hutchinson, gathered together the people in front of the Common House, the State House, the place of government, and stood on the balcony and declared to them that he would get to the bottom of this. In a famous statement, he said to them, "The law shall have its course. I will live and die by the law," meaning that the British soldiers would be tried in a Massachusetts court. He ordered the British flag lowered throughout the city. He ordered all the troops to pull back to a castle that was on the outskirts of town, removing them completely from the city. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty had their victory. And now they were about to get their vengeance, because these men, now called the Massacre of King's Road, later to be known as the Boston Massacre, were going to be tried for their crimes in a Massachusetts court. Samuel Adams helped the powers that be find the finest prosecutors in the land to take these men to task and have them executed, because the penalty, if they were convicted, was death. There was but one problem. In order for this trial to not be considered a sham, there had to be a defense attorney. That lonesome, sad character who is often loathed and disliked by everyone, who would have to step up and defend the 9 most horrible people in the history of the colonies. 8 soldiers and Captain raised my sword in the air, Preston, and ordered the death of innocent gentlemen without care. They could find no one. No one wanted the job. One day, a Tory friend of Captain Preston, who had now become quite desperate, feeling that he would not only not get a fair trial, he would be unable to have any kind of defense, came to a gentleman by the name of John Adams, a 35-year-old lawyer, small in stature, curly hair, balding on top, and a red face, but with fiery blue eyes, was asked to take the case. Adams knew that if he took this case, he would be hated, he would be loathed, he would be chased from city squares, mocked, and potentially even killed if he defended these people. Adams knew that his family would be in danger. He knew that his wife Abigail, who he loved dearly, would be in danger, as well as his children. He had plans for a political career and was really on the fast track to doing so. He was popular amongst the wealthier Bostonians and known as an exceptionally good lawyer. But he knew his political career would be destroyed. Adams took the case. It was a lonely time for Adams as he stood with a couple of other men that he commandeered into helping him against a growing tide of anger and animosity. Now, normally trials would come within a few days. They wouldn't wait. They would happen almost immediately. But this trial wouldn't come for 6 months because the judges knew that if they pushed the trial, the sentiment of the crowd would just be too much. So the trial was delayed clear till November of that same year in 1770. Trials also usually only lasted a day, calling every witness as quickly as they possibly could and getting it over. This would last 6 and be the longest in the history of the colonies up to that point, and for some time after. But most importantly, on the line was death. And Adams knew it. And Adams felt anxious and a great degree of pressure to protect his client. The role of a criminal defense attorney, as I mentioned, is lonely. You stand alone against the powers of the government and public sentiment to protect your client. I'm a criminal defense attorney, and having read all of these things in Adams' words, I will tell you it is easy to identify with the feelings of loneliness and anxiety that he felt. He didn't sleep. He had a hard time eating. A tremendous amount of pressure was on him because Adams believed these men, those men, to actually be innocent of the charges. And the charge was murder. The trial came, and as was custom of the time, judges, and still today, judges wore black. But in a death penalty case, judges wore red robes. And in a room bigger than this, but not much, the judges were gathered, put on the stand, on the bench, 4 of them, in the intimidating color of red, indicating that a failure by Mr. Adams would result in nearly immediate death. To the side stood his clients. His client first, Captain Preston. His trial came first. The other men were tried separately after. But Captain Preston's came first, and he stood for basically the whole trial in a box to the side. And the room was packed with people every day. Order was maintained. It was never a zoo or a circus in the court. But outside, the pressure mounted and continued to just feed on itself as everybody waited anxiously for the trial to unravel. Adams cross-examined witness after witness, each of who came with their own agenda and desire to tell their own story. Each of them had their own purpose for being there, and they came one after the other, telling their grisly stories. But masterfully, and with the art of cross-examination, Adams was able to extract the real story of what happened that night. First of all, Captain Preston was never behind his troops, and in fact, he was in front of his troop and repeatedly was telling his men not to fire. In fact, ordering them not to fire, even after it was the crowd that had attacked the British soldiers. In fact, Crispus had a club, as well as 12 other sailors who had come with large clubs and were beating at the soldiers. This was no gentleman's crowd. This was an angry mob, and they were out for vengeance. And they came with fervor and frustration and blood on their mind. And they did not yield. And Preston bravely actually stood between his men and the crowd, attempting to stop the bloodshed to the best of his ability. Unable to succeed, but he did what he could. And Adams revealed this methodically, day after day, as this trial went on. At the end of the trial, he gave what we call a closing argument or a summation. And in that summation, he made a few very important observations and statements. These statements actually have become, in large part of American lore, and actually very much a part of who we are. Before he made that closing final statement, he pointed out this to the jury. He said, "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." Meaning, you may, ladies, or gentlemen of the jury, no ladies, you may, gentlemen of the jury, have your desires and frustrations, and the crowd beyond those doors may be angry, but the facts are the facts. And the facts were, Captain Preston never said fire. In fact, the truth was, people in the crowd had been begging the soldiers to fire, taunting them. "Fire! Fire at us! Why don't you shoot? Don't you have the guts to shoot? Fire! Fire!" It kept being yelled over and over and over until finally one of the men had been knocked down, stood up and did discharge his weapon, and then the fight broke out and other weapons were indeed discharged and people did die. He pointed out to the crowd in really controversial statements to what the public believed based upon their television news reports to be the truth. He showed them the following. The attackers were a motley rabble of saucy boys, mulattoes, Irish teagues, and outlandish jacktars. Really cuss words of the day. I mean, you Irish teague and jacktar. I mean, we go, what? But that was harsh language. Shouting and hazing and threatening life, whistling, screaming, and rendering an Indian yell, throwing every species of rubbish they could pick up on the street. The jury was forced with a real dilemma. Should they convict men that they now knew to be innocent, or should they release them? What a challenge. What a nightmare. Even the court, the judges knew of the pressure. Adams also made this famous, what's called the Blackstone ratio, made this argument to the jury. He said to them, "It is more important that the innocent be protected than it is that guilty be punished. For guilt and crimes are so frequent in this world that they cannot all be punished." People often ask me, how can you defend those criminals? Well, really, truthfully, the job of a defense attorney is to point out the good in people, and the job of the prosecutor is to point out the bad in the person, and the judge decides how they feel about it. But I will tell you this, there's not a person in this room who I couldn't show within a moment had committed a crime or two in their life. And if you don't believe me, if you've ever speeded on the freeway more than 5 times, and you had been caught those 5 times, in California, you would have lost your license, had it suspended, and be facing on the 6th time a mandatory jail sentence. I think that's all of us that have ever driven a car. But his point is that, to the jury was, that all crimes cannot be punished. Then he says this very important thing that has shaped who all of us are. But if innocence itself is brought to the bar and condemned, meaning if an innocent man is brought here and condemned, perhaps to die, then the citizens will say, whether I do good or whether I do evil is immaterial, for innocence of itself will be no protection. And if such an idea as that were to take hold in the minds of the citizens, that would be the end of our security and our society. His time in front of the jury was stirring. It was powerful, and it laid a foundation for American law. It was the first time that the reasonable doubt instruction was given to a jury. The judges there felt so compelled that they had to formulate some method to protect the process. Now, this will surprise you, though. The reasonable doubt instruction, telling them if you have reasonable doubts, you should dismiss the case, was not given to protect Captain Preston. It was given to protect the jurors. The reason is that under Christian rules or law or belief, if you passed false judgment, meaning to condemn these men to death, that was a mortal sin which would render your soul in hell for eternity. So being a juror or a judge was a very serious offense. And the judge knew this. And so they fashioned a statement together saying, if you have reasonable doubts, don't convict. It was designed to protect the juror from hell. It wasn't designed for the guy in the chair. And those jurors took that very seriously because they knew that unless they had some type of reasonable doubts, in fact, up until a few years ago, our instructions all included the phrase "to a moral certainty," which was actually designed in that time period to protect their souls. You have to have a moral certainty. If you have a moral certainty and no reasonable doubts, you may convict. Now you're safe and your soul is safe. The jury, faced with this huge burden, knew that they had beyond reasonable doubts. They had tons of doubts. They knew that there was scattered evidence everywhere because Adams had done such a perfect, masterful, but most importantly, honest job in the defense of his clients. The verdict was not guilty. The Boston Gazette published that statement a week later on the 3rd page in the obituaries. Below, surprisingly, the death of one Abigail Adams, not his wife, of a local reverend, and a 93-year-old man, that big, found not guilty. But the legend of the Boston Massacre would not die. And the British were loathed and hated. A short time later, the other men were tried, and most of them were acquitted. 2, however, were not, Kilroy and Montgomery. Kilroy, with the rope maker, and Montgomery, one who shot perhaps first. They were convicted and condemned to death. However, Adams and his team found a loophole. And I think that the judges really wanted the loophole because they needed to make this thing go away. That loophole was called the right of clergy, or the benefit of clergy. And it was an ancient rule in medieval times which said basically if you were clergy and you could read, clergy being defined as being able to read the Bible, you got a pass. You got one free pass. You get to commit one free crime, and you don't have to go to prison and be executed. They invoked the right, but to do it, they had to read. Both men were illiterate. Fortunately, in the 1707 or 9, that reading rule had been kind of abolished, and all they had to do was quote one scripture from Psalms, which I imagine. Can you imagine the pressure of having to remember that one little scripture, stand up before those judges and cite it? If you succeed, you live. If you don't, you die. But the two men stood, invoked the benefit of clergy. They were granted. They succeeded. They said it correctly. And they were released. But not before they were branded on their left thumb, between their thumb and their hand, with the letter M. The letter M was to let anyone know that they had used their freebie. That way they could never do it again. They were all immediately shipped back to England, and really from that point forward, Boston would be free of any further British soldiers until really 1776, when the wars broke out. A few years later, well, before I go to a few years later, let me just say this. Adams, from this, gained fame and notoriety, but not popularity. However, he was elected to the legislature 3 months later. Some believe it was a conspiracy and a promised deal that if he took the case, he would get it. Actually, even by Samuel Adams, who, while he didn't want them acquitted, had really already won his victory. The British were gone, and there was no further bloodshed. They were second cousins, they were friends, and they would later serve on the Continental Congress, the first Continental Congress that went to Philadelphia in the formation of the Union. But Adams, on the third anniversary of the Boston Massacre and his trial, said the following in his journal, referring to the case. I devoted myself to endless labor and anxiety, if not to infamy and death, and that for nothing except what indeed was and ought to be in all a sense of duty. In the evening I expressed to Mrs. Adams all my apprehensions. That excellent lady, who has always encouraged me, burst into a flood of tears and said, she was very sensible of all the dangers to her and our children, as well as to me, but she had thought I had done as I ought, and was willing to share in all that was to come and place her trust in Providence. Abigail had supported him through the whole thing, through the rants, through the raves, and through the anger. And I will tell you, having tried cases where life hangs in the balance, where an innocent person has been charged and faces death, potentially, or the minimum life in prison, never to be released, there is deep anxiety. And truly, my wife shared tremendously with that anxiety. It could not and cannot be done, that lonely job that Adams had as the defense attorney, without the support of his wife, Abigail. And she knew she could die, as well as her children. But what was done was what ought to be done. Adams would finally say, before and after the trial, Preston sent me 10 guineas. He later would get a few more from the soldiers. 10 guineas, by the way, is not a lot. I looked it up. It's really hard to figure out because the prices fluctuate so much, but you could basically buy about 3 shotguns, or a brand new suit of clothes was about 4 guineas. So he could buy 2 new suits of clothes, or maybe a suit and a couple of shotguns for his service. Different than our shotguns, but that's what they were called, for his services in this. Not highly paid. This was his final statement to his defense. The part I took in the defense of Captain Preston and the soldiers procured me anxiety and infamy enough. It was, however, one of the more gallant, generous, manly, and disinterested actions of my whole life, and one of the best pieces of service I ever rendered my country. Judgment of death against those soldiers would have been as foul a stain upon this country as the execution of Quakers or witches anciently. As the evidence was, the verdict of the jury was exactly right. Alone, Adam stood up, not just for those men, but for what he knew was right and his country. Had they been convicted, it is certain that it would have been a foul stain upon our country. And Adams knew then and throughout his entire life that at that moment may have given cause to a popular notion of a revolution and a need for a revolution, but that justice had to have been done. The macro purpose by Samuel Adams may have been served, but the micro purpose of the individual was not forgotten by Adams. Often, I think we in society so often think of the macro purpose in our clamors for justice, for demands for imprisonment, or whatever it might be. But the micro should never be forgotten, because within the micro there is always more than meets the eye. And after all, each of us, as Adams so clearly understood, is a micro. We are individuals, part of a greater whole, but nonetheless individuals. And the media doesn't always get it right. Adams would go on to serve in the Continental Congress and become very important to the formation of our country. Those days and that story really created the foundation for who he was. And when he went off to Boston, went off to Washington and became part of the inner circle and team, there was something that went with him, however. Unlike Washington, who was stately and tall and powerful in his military stature, Jefferson, who was charming, good-looking, and eloquent beyond belief, unlike Alexander Hamilton, who was great at building a state and a nation, or like Madison, who was a constitutional genius, Adams really was hard to define. Who he was difficult to define, even to himself. He struggled with this. At one point, in 1775, he was with Washington, who was being sent off with the army in preparation for what was surely coming in a war. And he said to Abigail, "They go on my laurels. They go with what I have created. But I get no credit. I get nothing." And then he added the phrase, "a common cause," meaning it happens to me all the time. Adams always felt like he was never included in the God-making of the other revolutionaries. Really, truly. These men were made to look almost godlike. Washington painted with light behind him, coming down from heaven, holding laurels with angels. Jefferson standing stately in positions of glory and light. Madison the same. All of them, but Adams never got that. Even though he was part of that group that helped write the Declaration of Independence, even though it was him who managed 90 separate committees during the Revolutionary War, day after day after day, working to try to bring coalitions of Southern plantation owners and Northern merchants together in one cohesive unit. Without Adams, it would have fallen apart. He stood behind and kept the home fires burning. When he was sent to France to be an envoy to the French, he had to stand behind Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin. If Washington is the father of our country, Benjamin Franklin is the grandfather. Thomas Jefferson is that older brother that we love, and Adams might be crazy Uncle Manny in the closet of our country. But no one more important. But even Franklin said about him, he is a wise man of the finest heart, but sometimes he makes no sense. Franklin was often really frustrated dealing with the way Adams would do things. But nonetheless, he was a critical element in the writing of the Declaration of Independence and the formation of our country. He told Abigail in a letter, Abigail and he wrote thousands of letters, all of which are preserved, or most of which are preserved, and give us one of the deepest insights and looks into the revolutionary times. But Adams said actually to her, If the Declaration had been signed 6 months earlier, and then he adds, for reasons to which I cannot tell even you, the whole of Canada would have been ours. But it was not. It was signed today. It was actually signed on July 2nd, a day which he said would live forever as a great day. It was published 2 days later, which is why the 4th became the day of celebration. And he was fine with that. He said that it was signed that day because finally the American people, the colonists really, that's what they called themselves, had come to a place of understanding who they were. And even though they may have gained Canada, they might not have been soulfully ready for what they had to do to be truly independent. To Adams, they had to shake off many of their issues, their challenges, their infightings to become a whole unit. But that whole unit was created because of John Adams. Adams had brought them together. Adams had made them through his constant politicking, committee building, managing, articulation, and remembering the micro as well as the macro, the individual as well as the group in the creation of a nation. At the end of the Revolutionary War, Washington was the most popular man in the country, and it was to him to be the president. Although Adams did run, Washington gained the vast majority, and it was a given that Washington would really be the president. Adams' involvement was really very minor. It was always to be Washington. He was beloved by everyone, even though Adams wrote to Abigail he was sick and tired of those squabbling military officers walking around in their pompous uniforms. But Washington was truly the great one, and had been willing to do something that prior to that moment no man in the history of human race had ever done, and that was walk away from absolute power. Washington was in complete control, but he stepped down, deferring that absolute power to the Congress. Washington wouldn't just do that the one time at the end of the Revolutionary War. He would do it again when he left the presidency voluntarily, even though he was asked not to. It was Adams who formulated the name Mr. President, although he did want it to be Your Excellency the President or Your Highness the President, which Washington later said, too much, let's just keep it simple there, John. And it was dropped down to just Mr. President. Adams, however, was the vice president, a job to which he said to Abigail the following: my country, in its wisdom, contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever was the invention of man, ever contrived or imagined or conceived, the vice president. He hated it. He loathed being vice president because he did nothing. He had no power, no ability. He could do nothing except for wait to see if Washington died. And it was really an unhappy time for him. He ran for president now against his friend Thomas Jefferson. It was a terrible, terrible campaign. You talk about viciousness today, it has nothing compared to what Adams and Jefferson's teams did to one another. Jefferson was brutal. He was vicious, made up terrible stories. Adams was a very pure man, a man of great integrity who loved his wife and was not given to philandering or having girlfriends or any of that stuff that was very common amongst other men of the day. Not Adams. And his love for Abigail really was deep. When he was in France, he wrote her regularly and promised he would never leave her again, although he did. He never wanted to be away from her. And he was called many names. It was brutal, brutal, brutal. And Jefferson and Adams became enemies, not really talking to each other. And Jefferson, as was the custom, being the loser of the race, was made that insignificant role of vice president. But Jefferson managed it differently than Adams. He pushed and pulled and made it something more and hurt Adams tremendously. And when they ran again, Jefferson was elected and Adams was removed from office. But before he left, the White House had just been built as the residence of the president. He wouldn't stay in it for very long, and he wouldn't have much time there because Jefferson would take it over. But before he left, he said to his wife the following: I went into a room in the White House. He went upstairs. It was damp. It wasn't done. It was not a very nice place. It was still under construction. And he said to her, I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof. This was Adam's prayer for the president. This was his hope that the people that would follow and be there would be wise and honest people that would be true to the cause and never forget the individual. Adams would go on to retirement, leaving office and going away back up to Massachusetts to just become a farmer, country lawyer. Probably bugged Abigail for a lot of time, and she would die a few years later in 17, I think 17, at the age of 73 or 4. But Adam still had life in him. And after the death, something remarkable happened. He got a letter, and a correspondence began between him and Thomas Jefferson. Both now completely out of power, both now out of office, and both two of the only living revolutionaries left, in large part. It was the late 18 teens, 17, 18, 19 into the 20s, and the two men began to write a series of letters back and forth in which they talked about everything. About life, about God, about their relationship to the universe, and mostly about the old days. And their friendships were mended. Through this course of letters, these two men would grow closer perhaps than they ever had, but never see each other again. They would write, Adams would write long letters, Jefferson sometimes but a few lines, talking about how he could still ride a horse and Adams could still walk. As they grew older and older, they were alone. The last, really, of those great days. Adams, approaching his 90th year, actually now over 90, 90 and a half almost, was sick and tired and old and alone. He knew he would die soon. And knowing that he would die soon, he had some things that he wanted to say to a few people about the world to come. He said this as his last warning to Americans who now identified themselves as such, as July 4th of 1826, 50 years to the day of the publication, and now the dedicated day for the signing of the Declaration of Independence. This was what he said: My best wishes in the joys and festivities and the solemn services on that day of which will be completed the 50th year from its birth of the independence of the United States. A memorable epoch in the annals of the human race, destined in future histories to form the brightest or the blackest page, according to the use or the abuse of those political institutions by which they shall in time come to be shaped by the human mind. He warned his fellow Americans that he knew they would create new institutions, new agencies, new powers, new ways to exercise their authority. And he warned them that it would either be a great or a black day, and prayed that it would be good and honorable. July 4th came, now very sick. He could barely even recognize, but he knew it was the 4th. And he said to one of his sons, one of his other sons was the president, John Quincy Adams. He said to his son, this is a good day. No, a great day. At 6:20 that evening, death was near. He sat up, looked at his family, and said, Jefferson survives, and died. Fearing that Jefferson had outlived him, perhaps fearing that he would be forgotten, perhaps that his old friend was still alive, he died. What he didn't know was that Thomas Jefferson had died 3 hours earlier, 50 years to the day. These two men who sat in an upper room and signed their names as they prepared the Declaration of Independence, enemies allies, friends, died 50 years to the day within 3 hours of each other on July 4th. Adams, however, will always be hard to understand. Like I mentioned, others looked godlike. Adams never did. In time, Washington got a monument, Jefferson got a monument, others got monuments. Adams really never did. His place was never given. And although there's a committee that's been formed to give him a monument, even now that monument is to the Adams family, not specifically to John. It will be ultimately the Adams family monument. But nonetheless, without John Adams, it is hard to imagine an America or a justice system that would be what it is today. His true desire had been to be the first Chief Justice of the United States. He didn't get that job. He would have liked it. He would have loved it. But it wasn't for him. His was to be different. His was to always be the outsider looking in, never really being given the credit, but at the same time being that foundation upon which all of us, every single one of us, share in the benefit of liberty and freedom. Thank you.